Okay, I think we've got the set changed, as they say here, quick set change, and a different audience or different set of participants up here, but I think a very interesting conversation that we're going to have. So I'm delighted to welcome today Thione Niang and and Professor Rabih Motar. I'll tell you a little bit more about them in just a moment, but I want to frame this just to give you a little bit of idea of why this session is here. And the reason it's here, think about it as the filling between two pieces of bread, if you will, the tasty filling in the middle of two pieces of bread. The first piece of bread was this morning when we talked about food security in Africa, and after these conversations, we're going to have a session on energy, an emerging Atlantic energy program. So the question is, how do you link those two? That's what we really want to talk about here today. And we have two rather extraordinary people here that can help us discuss those links and help us to frame all of that. So let me just introduce for a moment. The first one here with me is Thione Niang. Thione is with Aecon Lighting Africa. I think many of our emerging leaders certainly know about Aecon, popular music star in Africa and even in the United States. And he is from Senegal. I can't help but resist mentioning that he comes from a family of 28 children. I'm just trying to think of how many nieces and nephews you must have there, but there must be an awful lot of them there. He came to the United States in the year 2000, studied in Ohio, went to school in Ohio, at a business school there, and became very active in democratic politics there, was active in the Obama campaign, was appointed as a liaison to the minority communities by President Obama. In 2009, he helped launch an organization called Give It, which is an NGO that works with young leaders promoting economic and social progress, which today is operating in many countries around the world, I believe. And he's now, of course, teamed up with Aecon to be the founder of Aecon Lighting Africa. And we're going to come back to what Aecon Lighting Africa is in just a second. But let me just also introduce Dr. Rabih Motar, who holds two titles as the founding director of the Qatar Environmental and Energy Research Institute, and also is a professor at Texas A&M University. He tells me he teaches a course now in Nexus, which I'm really going to be interested in finding out exactly when a student signs up to say, I'm studying Nexus, exactly what they're studying here. But he's done extensive work on the Nexus, or the link, if you will, between energy and food security. Originally, Dr. Motar comes from Lebanon. He's an engineer and is an engineer in hydrology, something that's a great interest to me coming from Arizona, where we have a very active arid lands program at the university I used to represent in Congress, the University of Arizona. Let me start with a question here with you, Thione, with Mr. Niang here. You've developed and championed what you call a three-phase model to provide affordable, accessible, clean energy. Tell us what this project is about and what you see its future. How is it going to really make a difference in Africa?
Well, Aecon Lighting Africa is a project that we started two years ago, a little over 2 years. I invited Aecon to come and participate in the project that I have in Washington, now in 30 countries. It's called Give One Project, which we help to engage young people in entrepreneurship. We have been setting up incubation centers throughout the continent, in Europe also, even in Asia, but 19 other 30 countries are in Africa. When he came to Washington, when we finished the program in the White House, we sat down and we discussed what can we do for the continent. Both of us originally from Senegal, and I remembered growing up in Kaolack in Senegal, where my grandparents used to wake me up early in the morning to study, because prior to that night, the sun went down a little earlier. We grew up with no energy in my house, and traveling around the world and having the opportunity to see how things are going in the US but in other countries, I thought it was important to create that opportunity that I don't have for millions of young Africans. Today, 600 million Africans are without energy. So my background is not on energy. I have no idea what it is about. Akon, of course, background is not on energy. So we went out for 6 months looking for a third partner. So we found another friend of ours from Mali who has been working on solar energy for quite a while in Africa. Then we teamed up and launched Akon Lighting Africa. As you can see from the beginning, that this is a very personal project to me. Today, in two years, we are in 15 countries. In all of those countries, we have three-phase projects that we put together. The first one was to make sure that the public areas in these countries are lit up. Recently, we were inaugurating a village, remote village in Mali, in Kai, and we met so many women around 11 p.m. selling some mangoes, and some of them selling some watermelons, and some of the stores, everything is out. They're telling us, without these street lights, we usually close and go home at 5:30, 6 o'clock before it gets dark. Today, we go up till 11:30 or 12 o'clock for two reasons. Why? Because now they can make more money, but also there's security in the community. The street lights was important to us. Then we have the second phase. The second phase is now the home systems, to make sure that at home, the young person like me will be able to study their homeworks at night. And we've studied the second phase. And the third one, which we are now implementing and modeling in Guinea Equatorial and in Benin, is the mini-grid systems, which will allow those remote villages that don't have no connection to the national grid will be able to have a solar mini-grid there that the whole community will be able to connect to. So this work is challenging. It's a lot of work, but we accept the challenges. We accept the roadblocks. What we don't accept is to continue as young Africans born in the continent to watch our people go through darkness. Because without energy, you don't have no economy, as I talked about the example of those ladies. Without energy, you have no education. Without energy, you have no health, because all those health clinics that I see throughout the continent in Kenya, when we went through those villages to give lights to those villages right outside of Nairobi, most of them can't go to the hospital at night because they have no energy. And this is something that's personal to us, and we are working hard to make sure the continent is lit up.
Thank you for that great description of it. I'm going to come back. I want to talk some more about, obviously, the energy, and we're going to link it back to the food security. But first, let me ask a question, an opening question for Dr. Motar. You've written and talked extensively about the link between energy and food security. In fact, I think you just told me you were at the White House last week talking about this very subject there. For a layman or somebody that doesn't use that term very often, when you use the word nexus, what do you mean? And what are the practical, do you have some examples of some success stories of how using this nexus concept has actually resulted in change?
Thank you. I'll start with the need for the nexus and maybe try to shed some light on defining it. We don't have enough to run around in terms of resources. We are in a resource-scarce environment, and we continue as we move forward with a lot of stresses in terms of population growth, climate change, and this non-stationarity of the world we know. As a hydrologist, we used to predict future knowing the past. That non-stationarity in rainfall events, in the way we predict climate is one example of this uncertainty. So if I link the resource scarcity with the non-stationarity and the changes that's going to happen in the demography, in the population, and climate, along with a very significant element, which is the interconnectedness of these resources. The fact that you need energy to produce water, you need water to produce food, you need energy to produce food, and all of these very, very interlinked system. In the past, we had a lot of buffer, and we could afford losing that interconnectivity because we had enough. As we move forward with a lot of gaps in terms of water gap, food gap, people are talking about 40% future water gap. We're talking about doubling the food supply. We could argue whether doubling or the White House issued last June 75% more. We could argue about the numbers. But one thing we don't argue about is that the fact that these systems are interlinked and we are in a resource-scarce environment. For those reasons, we're losing the buffer. And we're moving into an interconnected system where we define these interlinkages at the local level, at the regional, and then the national level. Definition is in 30 seconds, you could realize that these systems are interlinked. This is the beginning of that realization. We need to quantify these interlinkages. But one thing more importantly is after you put these interlinkages in a quantifiable term, what do you do with them? And you start looking into futuristic scenarios of what are the trade-offs between water and food. And yes, there are. We talked earlier about the trade-off between food and energy, trade-off between water and food. These trade-offs need to put in context. And unless we develop a dialogue that takes these trade-offs into public discussion, we're not going to make a move forward. On the examples piece, two examples come to mind. One is the Qatar National Food Security Program that led the food portfolio, food resilience in the state of Qatar, looking holistically at that whole system. And I'll talk more recently about Texas, and one of the cities in Texas that is I would say, a prime example of the nexus is 1/3 of the water is going to industry, 1/3 is going to municipality, and 1/3 is going to agriculture. And these three sectors are growing independently with an assumption of future forecast for water demand. Unless we bring all these three sectors into one platform, and the industry is predominantly the hydraulic fracturing industry, unless there are trade-off and discussions about what are the priorities and how are we going to partition and manage the water for the good for the whole, we will be losing that prime resource. So we are working on that trade-off analysis where we do the analytics. The scientific community is good at that, but we stop at that analytics, and we need to take it one further step forward where the analytics become a catalyst for the debate, a debate that happens to be inclusive, all the stakeholders to be in the room to discuss, these are the trade-offs. Do I use my water for hydraulic fracturing for energy security for the country, or I use it for food production, or I use it for a growing urban population? Those are in conflict, but we need to move from that conflict zone to a zone of a green zone where we start talking about these discussions and make collective decisions about the future. And this is where the platform that the Nexus allows, that it wasn't available before.
Well, that's very interesting because I guess in a sense, in Arizona, we were talking about Nexus before I even knew what Nexus really was. When I was in the legislature, we redid the groundwater code in Arizona. And at that time, Arizona was using 89% of its water for agriculture. It's still very high, even though we're considered one of the most urbanized states in the country. It's still very high, well over, it's about 70% today. So this issue of trade-offs was the exact issue that was involved in this redoing the code. So we want to come back to that when we talk about policy and policymakers. But Mr. Niang, we've just been talking here about water and its relationship to agriculture. You've been talking about your project as for lighting. Do you see, since agriculture, we had the section this morning talking about agriculture making Africa sustainable. and independent in its food production. But that can't happen in a continent like Africa without a lot of irrigation. Do you see a role for the kind of work you're talking about with Aecon Lighting in providing water, the pumping and the movement of water from one place to another?
Of course, we already been testing that in Mali, and I'm just coming here from the Gambia, where on our project we have an agricultural incubation center in the Gambia, a little outside of Banjul. I spent a week there, coming straight from there to here, where we have young people from Banjul we took to the ground, started agriculture, and what I identified there is the main problem is water. 3 months ago, we've given our first model, the pumping model that we needed to put in place in Bamako, a little bit outside of it also, where they're using solar energy to pump water to irrigate and also do agriculture. Aecon Lighting Africa was just the first thing, but we knew energy, we have to do energy, was key. And the second thing after energy we want to do is to make sure we find ways to bring clean energy, clean water to Africa. And we are, at this time right now, exploring those opportunities. And pretty soon you'll be hearing the next announcement we'll be doing, the work that we're going to do in clean energy.
So
clean
you
water.
see incorporating the water into the work that Aecon Lighting is doing now.
Exactly.
Okay, so that'll
Exactly.
become an integral part.
Exactly.
Well, and so that clearly leads to not only clean water for sanitation, for drinking,
But
reducing.
for agriculture also.
But also for water
agriculture.
sufficient for
course.
agricultural use there. Interesting.
Right.
What, Dr. Mokhtar, what are some of the gaps that exist now that we see in the, for making this nexus work, whether it's in science or it's in technology or in, for that matter, in public policy? And how do we address those through the nexus?
I'd like to start with the stakeholders. Last week, ironically, I was in DC talking about the nexus, and a group of computer scientists, very goodwill and lot of energy and a lot of concern about the farming community. And a big effort came into an e-farm. An e-farm is the new wave of having farmers have access to data. So I asked the question, how many of you have been on a farm? These are computer scientists, very bright, very good intention of doing something good for humanity. None of them. So before I answer, I'd like to put the context of this. And that's the farmer himself, if you're talking about food security. We need to ask them what they need, rather than us trying to put together a solution that's very elegant that they may not need. So some of the gaps is our understanding in what are the local needs. So framing that question within a context of the stakeholders. So I'd like us to start by defining the stakeholder, who they are, and trying to address their needs. In terms of the gaps, I mean, we could talk extensively about this, but I'm going to highlight one gap in each, in the science and in the policy, and maybe come back and how do we tie them. A lot of the science developed in many of the, what I call the farming community, if the context is about food security, is imported. We need local knowledge, we need local data, we need local technologies. We don't need an imported technology that will not find its way to resolving the local problems. So capacity building, indigenous knowledge need to be promoted, and based on that, the ground level for that is to look into adaptive technology for that. So the science, local, and I would emphasize local science, is very much in need. In the policy area, and we see this in our home country back in the US, and many, in fact, I haven't seen a good example of a good governance for these systems. We have silos, we have built silos in these primary resources, water, energy, food, and very difficult for these silos to communicate. So on the governance issue of these primary resources, we do need to invest on how do you create that platform to govern food security while food security is dependent on water security and energy security. So how do you govern these primary resources? That's the policy issue. And the last is how do we develop these kind of platform where policy, science are all together. You inform policymakers. We don't claim we shouldn't be in a position to make policies, but we should be in a position to provide science-based policy so that policymaker can make that informed decision. So we need the local information within a context of the stakeholders. We need to tie in the pieces of the governance of these primary resources, and we need to get the science and policy together.
Well, so what you're saying on the first part there is, put it very simply, one shoe doesn't fit all sizes.
Thank you.
Or one size doesn't fit all shoes there, whatever we want to say it.
Thank you.
In other words, it has to be localized, and the kind of science and technology we use in one place may not work in another kind of a place.
I mean, I can give you tons of examples of how technology could fail. You could, I mean, I spent some years in the Gulf states, in Qatar. You bring a German technology that works perfectly in Germany. You take it in the deserts with a lot of dust. I'm talking about solar energy. It doesn't work. So you need to, on top of getting that nice, shiny material, you need to have a way to clean it. And a lot of the cleaning is water. So where are you going to get the water to the middle of the desert to clean it? So adaptive technology that is developed for the region, for the locale, wherever we are, is very, very important. The maintenance, the capacity building for fixing whatever maintenance needs happen. So that's why the local capacity building is extremely important.
Mr. Niang, it occurs to me that we didn't even say right at the beginning, but everything you've been talking about in terms of energy, developing energy and producing energy is solar. Is that not correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Do you ever see a role for other forms of energy in what you're doing, or is it going to be solar, you think, sustainable energy?
Yeah, there's a lot of forms of energy
of course
has been tried all over the world. But when we look at what we can bring in, we've seen that in Africa, we have, in sub-Saharan Africa, 362 days of sun. And we have so much resources in the continent, and the sun being one of it, that we will never run out of sun. So why not utilize the sun so we don't depend on oil or what was done in the US or in Europe and other countries that didn't work. Africa leaves the space now to try new avenues. And today, the solar market is very cheap. Not only is cheap, but technology-wise, it's very advanced. So we say, let's go explore it. We've created a partnership block where we brought in the Germans, people from the UK, companies in China, because whatever we might say is cheaper in China than anywhere in the world. And then we brought in the Americans for quality control to make sure we provide the best in the market for Africa. But this is the two things that we came into that was issues that we had to resolve ASAP. When we went to negotiate with our partners, the most important thing was to make sure that we do the transfer of knowledge in the continent. Because many times foreign companies come in, they bring their workers to do the work in the continent. Then once the project is done, they go back home, right? So us being from Africa, children of Africa who went through it, we want to make sure what we bring in the continent stays sustainable. So in our negotiations, for example, in China, the thing was, well, we'll send you in each country 200, 300 workers. I said, no, what we're going to need is a manager and a quality control manager. Then we went to each country, to give one project, we're already around the continent. We took those young people, we trained them, and they're the ones who are installing now these lights we put it in, and to do the maintenance that you just talked about. So we went on even further. We just launched now a solar academy, the first solar academy in Africa, where we train 30 young people every 3 months. Then as soon as they're done, we give them the job available. In 2 years, we've hired 5,200 young people are working across the continent helping us to electrify it with solar. Why solar? Because that's, again, it's here. We're not going to run out of solar. It's cheap, it's sustainable.
Yeah. We're going to go to the audience in just one second. But Dr. Mokhtar, you and I have one quick follow-up to
Very
what Ms.
quickly,
Niang said. Yes.
we haven't had the chance to talk, so this is our first introduction. And my wish to you is to learn from others' examples.
Good.
What we don't want to have is another Indian example where we deplete our groundwater. So giving farmers free energy that they can pump their groundwater is great, but it needs to be managed properly because there's a trade-off
right.
between our water resources and ill-managed water management.
There's
Well,
there's
for the free
there's the
energy.
nexus we're talking about.
So we need to be...
But even with the farmers, we don't agree on giving free energy, right? You know, in Africa, we're in a position today we don't want anything free. At least that's our motto. Keep the free stuff. Because we're used to the free stuff and it doesn't work. So our model is how we can make it in a point where people are responsible of their own to what we bring in.
My earlier, it could be free, but when you have access to energy, that farmers have access.
I just don't know about the free energy. It just doesn't click right for me. I want to make sure that the energy we're bringing in, that's why our second point that I talked about in those three phases is prepaid. So even you taking it to the farmers, they have to be able to pay something.
That wasn't my point. My point is very simple. We need to look at something, new concept on water productivity. Okay. I want to make sure that this water that they're pumping is, water should not be free. That was my point. We don't want to deplete the groundwater for the sake of...
We're going to go to the audience, but the one quick question I had that we can ask very quickly here. We're talking about solar energy, Ms. Niang. And that implies it's sustainable, but it also implies that it has to go with the energy storage, which is batteries or whatever, and that's an area where we have a lot of work to be done, isn't it?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, because when you talk about the marketplace, they can't turn the sun on at 11 o'clock at night, so they have to have storage for that electricity. That's a good important point. All right, let's go to the audience here, and I see some right here. Yes. Please identify yourself, and it's on.
Hi, so I'm Felicia from Colombia, and I'm one of the emerging leaders. I'm so glad you brought the financing and the prepaid because my question was for both of you. I think one of the gaps that you failed to mention is financing. How is Africa and the world financing all these projects that we're talking about? And the similar for you, it's how are you making sure that your business is sustainable, not only for the farmers, but for the villages that you're taking, so they can not only get the product, buy it, but also make it sure that they're returning your investment and returning all the other businesses you're doing.
You want to go first? Or?
Yeah, look, why don't you take it from the larger, and we'll take it down to the local level in Africa. How do we do this sustainable?
You're absolutely correct. Financing is one of the critical issue to get that get started, and I believe that it has to be financed. And I very much agree with the model. It has to be a PPP, partnership between private public sector, that the private sector need to invest. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. We know I don't want to go into the governance, which has failed in terms of the water, energy, food in most of the African continent. It has to be financed, but we're yet at the beginning of that discussion. What's the governance structure that govern these primary resources? But financing is one of them. Incentive, pricing, all of this discussion was at the beginning. I can't agree with you more.
So, Mr. Young, the village in Mali getting lighting for their marketplace, how is that financed?
Well, for the financing, this is what we are doing. There's two parts to it. The first one is with the government first. The government takes care of the street lights to make sure that the mosque, the public areas, the church, the hospitals are taken care of. And for that, we come with pre-financing. We secured $1 billion line of credit with our partners. And we come in the country, we talk to the government to propose to come in with the pre-financing. When they tell us this is the localities that we want to do, we negotiate with them the terms of payment. It's got to be a government guarantee loan that we come in, we pre-finance it, and we electrify it. If every country is different. And the recent contract we just got is Benin, where they pay every year, and they go from 3 years to 5, 6 years payment. Now, the second phase was to make sure how the population will get it and it's not free. So we did a study to go around those villages with our team to see how much they're paying in kerosene and candles. Because we don't want to bring something, even though it's solar lights, but we want to make sure people can afford it. So we bring the price up to the same amount of money that they were paying. Now the difference will be that it's safer health-wise, because for the environment, many of those villages are catching fires sometimes because of the kerosene. Health hazard is not healthy. So for that, they're taking our project. So it's a prepaid. You get the system, you have 1 year and 2 months to pay for it. And what you are spending in kerosene, you pay for it for the Selectra system. It's like a scratch card. You see in Africa, everybody using the telephone cards. Americans might not understand what that is, but if you start traveling here, you're going to start having top-off. So you do the top-off, and then when it's finished, you have to go back and recharge. In a year and 2 months, now the system is yours. You don't have to pay for it anymore. So what we did is, in those communities, we selected the young people. Job creation is very important to what we do. They're the one we will maintain, but then they'll be the one that will be selling those cards. And if there's problems in the system, they're already trained in our Solar Academy, then they can go immediately and fix the issues. The reason why we did that is because we were in Sierra Leone with President Koroma. He tells us, before you came to my house, everything you see in those lights was put in. Just 2 years ago by an Indian company. And 8 months later, the batteries went out, and all of those lights are not working. I've seen it in Dakar. I've seen it in Benin. I've seen it in many, many countries in Africa. I've seen it in Kenya, where people can put in lights, but there is no maintenance system behind it. Then the result, after a few months, those batteries need to be maintained. They all go out. So what we did is now recruiting those young people, training them to make sure that they have some money, and then immediately they help us to fix those problems every time there's an issue that occurred. So those are the two financing models that we have.
Maintenance of the system is a key part.
It's the key when it comes to solar.
Right, so
if you don't maintain it,
right,
after 8 months, you lose it. No matter how the battery is good, because it can rain, it can, sometimes the sun, anything, you have to make sure you take care of it.
All right, let's go to another question out here in the audience. If we see anybody else that has one here. Okay, everybody's fulfilled with their things, but let's, yes, we have one over here.
Thank you. My name is Hafsat Abiola Costello. I'm from Nigeria. I have a question for each of you, and since there were no other questions yet, perhaps I could ask. For you with Acorn Lighting, I work with GIZ, and I remember you mentioned that you work also with the Germans. Is it with the German Agency for International Cooperation?
German company.
With the German government?
No, there's a private German company.
Private company.
Because I'm very interested in what you're saying, because I was serving in the cabinet of Ogun State government up until May, and we have a lot of interest from the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Germans to help with bringing renewable energy to us. And each of them have very different methods, which I've been enjoying watching the differences. But the Germans, I find that their method is perhaps the slowest and perhaps the best. The Chinese are very fast, and it's useful for us to have very quick solutions, especially in the urban centers, which is their area of interest, and they'll make quick money, quick returns from that. The Germans are focused on renewable energy for rural areas. And they have a different model from yours, which I would like to propose to you for you to consider. So you are the agent that goes in and you train and you also put in the system. What they do is a little different. They do proof of concept for private sector to show that it can work, and private sector then run. And what that will do is you could reach 100 million, you blink and you can reach 100 million because you've proved the concept. And to do proof of concept is extremely hard because there are some policy gaps, policies that are needed that are not in place, that they work to identify and coordinate the introduction of those policies into governments and train private sector. Then they even train the financial institutions to provide the different kinds of financing of varied terms. So by the end, the private sector can just run. So you are one, but you could produce 1,000 or you could produce 10,000, and then you can see the multiplications of scale from that model. So it's something just for you to consider.
Thank you.
Could you very quickly ask the question for Dr. Muhtar, so then we can have them both respond? We're running out of time.
I'm sorry. So Dr. Muhtar, I found your presentation very interesting because you were talking about science and this nexus. And where I come from is a country where there are multiple ethnic groups always fighting and having different interests. And you talked about trade-offs and how you use your model to look at trade-offs between in the science and the policy. I wonder if it could be used even for actual interests, that maybe it's not even so much science, but it's just returns, varied returns, differing returns. If this person, the returns to this ethnic group would come at such a time and this, how could such a model, because I think some of the fights we have, the conflict we have in Africa, is because the mechanisms we're using to engage in the dialogue is not adequate to the problems and the complexity of the problems faced.
Let's go in reverse order. Muhtar, you want to respond first, and then we'll go. Yeah.
I come from Texas, okay? So we have similar issues with the energy sector,
Yes.
with the municipalities, with the agriculture. And some of the work we're doing is we provide the trade-offs, we provide scenarios. We don't provide solutions. So the audience, which is a multiple stakeholder, vertical and horizontal, at all scales in a vertical sense, from a local all the way to national, in this case, statewide, and horizontal, representing all of the stakeholders that are impacted. So the hydraulic fracturing is an example that we're analyzing the energy security for this state, which is an emotional issue. We want to have energy security, but it comes at a cost. The cost is the transportation sector is, in Texas, $2 billion a year is in wear and tear for the roads. Not all of it, some of it is induced by energy use. You have the other sector that's pretty much is deprived more and more from the water is the agricultural food security issue. And if you don't have that sector satisfied, you're going to have some issues with food security. The third sector is the municipalities. A lot of the areas in Texas, the 3 of the top 5 cities, fastest growing cities in the US are in Texas. So there's an urban sprawl in many of these metropolitan areas that require more and more water. So this is a typical example of the nexus where you have competing need. And not everybody's going to have everything they want or they need. There need to be an analytics, but the analytics need to go down, not biased to any of these sectors, but to provide the trade-off. And as a society inclusive, we need to decide what is more important, energy security, economic, social, environmental. When we define the metrics, then everything becomes a trade-off that society need to address. We'll be happy to talk afterward because it's very interesting to engage. This is basically a conflict resolution exercise that would like to see. So unless it's taken to these issues that are very much controversial, the science will be on the shelf and a publication. So thank you.
Ms. Niang, you want to respond to her suggested model that you should think about?
Yeah, sure. I'll think about it, and I'll see you after this. Thank you.
Okay.
It's a good model. I'd like to talk to you about it. In the meantime, we're going to stick with our model.
Okay.
Because it's working pretty well. So.
You said that, yeah, we're going to conclude here, but you said, I think in what I read, I think you've said that you hope to be operating in almost every African country in 5 years by the year 2020.
40 countries, yeah.
40 countries. That's,
Because Morocco is a part of Africa, but they don't need it because they,
yeah.
yeah.
You think that's doable, feasible? Will the limitation be
Well,
financing?
No, because we secured the most important thing was the financing. Before we jumped in the water, we went to get the money first because we knew the problem with many African countries is the financing. Many of these countries got plans to really electrify their country, but they cannot find the money. And I think that's where our model is so different, because we come with the pre-financing. So the first thing we did was to secure the money, then we come in to propose to the governments to what we can do. Yes, it will be challenging. We knew it would be challenging. I mean, a political strategist to doing energy in Africa, you know it's going to be challenging. Every day is a learning process for me and for ACON, for Samba, and all of our partners. But we're ready to take on that challenge because we're ready to change Africa. We were ready to make sure that the millions of people of Africa will have the same opportunities as me. I want the same thing that I have in America for my people in Africa to have. And I'm not going to sit aside and let other people to come to do it or expecting somebody to do it. We've coming back home to bring our contribution to what will change the continent. That's a role we have to take on. Every generation at some point will have to answer some key questions, right? In America, a young president called onto the country in 1960s, President Kennedy, to ask everyone, ask for what you can do for your country and not what your country can do for you. And today, in my generation, this new generation of Africans, are calling on to ourselves, to what we can do to change the continent. And it's going to take work. We know it's challenging, but we will do it. And if we fail to finish it, we know the thousands of young people who are training in leadership and entrepreneurship throughout the continent. I'm hoping they will take on the fight and make it happen.
Well, that's a great
Thank you.
words to end on, I think. I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and I hope you can see some of the linkages between the two sessions that we've had on food security and the energy one we're having, and I really appreciate our two participants for their conversance here, for everything they've done to help us make those linkages. So please join me in thanking Dr. Mokhtar and Ms. Niang.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.